To make the call as unobtrusive as possible, they left the cottage by the wicket leading down from the high road to the dairy house, and descended the track on foot side by side. The withy bed had been cut, and they could see over the stumps the spot to which Clare had followed her when he pressed her to be his wife. To the left the enclosure in which she had been fascinated by his harp, and far away, behind the cow stalls, the mead which had been the scene of their first embrace. The gold of the summer picture was now grey, the colours mean, the rich soil mud, and the river cold. Over the Barton gate the dairyman saw them, and came forward, throwing into his face the kind of jocularity deemed appropriate in Talbothays and its vicinity on the appearance of the newly married. Then Mrs. Crick emerged from the house, and several others of their old acquaintance, though Marian and Retty did not seem to be there. Tess valiantly bore their sly attacks and friendly humours, which affected her far otherwise than they supposed. In the tacit agreement of husband and wife to keep their estrangement a secret, they behaved as would have been ordinary. And then, although she would rather there had been no word spoken on the subject, Tess had to hear in detail the story of Marian and Retty. The latter had gone home to her father's, and Marian was left to look for employment elsewhere. They feared that she would come to no good. To dissipate the sadness of this recital, Tess went and bade all her favourite cows good-bye, touching each of them with her hand, and she and Clare stood side by side at leaving, as if united body and soul. There would have been something peculiarly sorry in their aspect to one who should have seen it truly. Two limbs of one life as they outwardly were, his arm touching hers, her skirts touching him, facing one way as against all the dairy facing the other, speaking their adieu as we, and yet sundered like the poles. Perhaps something unusually stiff and embarrassed in their attitude, some awkwardness in acting up to their profession of unity, different from the natural shyness in young couples, may have been apparent, for when they were gone Mrs. Crick said to her husband, "How unnatural the brightness of her eyes did seem, and how they stood like waxen images and talked as if they were in a dream. Didn't it strike ye as 'twas so? Tess had always summat strange in her, and she's not now quite the proud young bride of a well-be-doing man." They re-entered the vehicle, and were driven along the roads towards Weatherbury and Stagfoot Lane, till they reached the Lane Inn, where Clare dismissed the fly and the man. They rested here a while, and entering the Vale, were next driven onward towards her home by a stranger who did not know their relations. At a midway point, when Nuttlebury had been passed, and where there were cross-roads, Clare stopped the conveyance, and said to Tess that if she meant to return to her mother's house, it was here that he would leave her. As they could not talk with freedom in the driver's presence, he asked her to accompany him for a few steps on foot along one of the branch roads. She assented, and directing the man to wait a few minutes, they strolled away. "Now let us understand each other," he said gently. "There is no anger between us, though there is that which I cannot endure at present. I will try to bring myself to endure it. I will let you know where I go as soon as I know myself, and if I can bring myself to bear it, if it is desirable, possible, I will come to you. But until I come to you, it would be better that you would not try to come to me." The severity of the decree seemed deadly to Tess. She saw his view of her clearly enough. He could regard her in no other light than that of one who had practised gross deceit upon him. Yet could a woman who had done even what she had done deserve all this? but she could contest the point with him no further. She simply repeated after him his own words. "Until you come to me, I must not try to come to you?" "Just so." "May I write to you?" "Oh yes, if you are ill or want anything at all. I hope that it will not be the case, so that it may happen that I write to you first." "I agree to the conditions, Angel, because you know best what my punishment ought to be. Only don't make it more than I can bear." This was all she said on the matter. If Tess had been artful, had she made a scene, fainted, wept hysterically in that lonely lane, notwithstanding the fury of fastidiousness with which he was possessed, he would probably not have withstood her. But her mood of long suffering made his way easy for him, and she herself was his best advocate. Pride so entered into her submission, which perhaps was a symptom of that reckless acquiescence in chance so apparent in the whole d'Urberville family, and the many effective chords which she could have stirred by an appeal were left untouched. The remainder of their discourse was on practical matters only. He now handed her a packet containing a fairly good sum of money which he had obtained from his bankers on the purpose. The brilliants, the interest in which seemed to be Tess's for her life only, if he understood the wording of the will, he advised her to let him send to a bank for safety, and to this she readily agreed. These things arranged, he walked with Tess back to the carriage and handed her in. The coachman was paid and told where to drive her. Taking next his own bag and umbrella, the sole articles he had brought with him hitherwards, he bade her good-bye, and they parted there and then. The fly moved creepingly up a hill, and Clare watched it go with an unpremeditated hope that Tess would look out of the window for one moment. But that she never thought of doing, would not have ventured to do, lying in a half-dead faint inside. Thus he beheld her recede, and in the anguish of his heart quoted a line from a poet, with particular emendations of his own. "God's not in his heaven, all's wrong with the world." When Tess had passed over the crest of the hill, he turned to go his own way, and hardly knew that he loved her still. End of chapter 37